Okay. Good. So welcome everybody, and a happy new year to all. So my course on fiscal policy and stabilization is going to be a set of 16 lectures. I have taught this course for quite a few years at IIM Calcutta, but this is the first time I am teaching it at IGIDR. So, for managers with a marginal interest in macroeconomics, the course was structured very differently. And I have reworked the course a little bit to suit economic students. So you will need a little bit of econometrics. The first part of time series analysis will be needed, okay, in this course. So you have read the write-up that I had on the course, right? So let me go to that and is the screen available? Is this visible to everybody?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what we are going to discuss is basically fiscal policy, but there will be some discussion on monetary policy as well. But the bulk of the course will be on fiscal policy. Okay, and we are going to deal. Yes, somebody was trying to say something. Okay, so we are basically going to deal with an anomaly that has been discovered by quite a few economists, that fiscal policy in advanced countries is counter-cyclical, but fiscal policy in developing countries is pro-cyclical. Now, even with a very rudimentary idea of macroeconomics, this comes as a shock to many people as to how is it that fiscal policy is pro-cyclical. Okay, what are its consequences? What are the reasons behind it? And what steps can be taken to attempt to move towards counter-cyclical fiscal policy? Okay. In fact, as we will see as we go on in the course, that for some underdeveloped countries, even monetary policy is pro-cyclical. We will also try and say something on India towards the end, because there is research on this in India as well. Okay, but first I have to impress upon you that this is a topic that merits a course. Okay, so that is what we will attempt to do today. Okay, and this reading list that I have given is indicative. New papers will, of course, be put in. I am in the process of identifying them. Two have already been identified. A few more, once I identify, I will put them up. There is already the paper that we are going to discuss today has already been uploaded on Teams, so you can all take a look at it. Now, on this page, right at the end, there are 3 papers from a book. Okay, and I'm going to struggle with this a little bit because the library is closed, and I'm not sure whether I will be able to make these available to you. Okay, if I can't make them available, then I won't discuss them. I'll replace it by something else. But these are really good papers. Okay, as you will see that this is a book that is edited by Akraloff, Blanchard, Romer, and Stieglitz. 4 names that anybody having anything to do with macroeconomics will obviously be very familiar with. So it's an excellent book. And these 3 papers are really good. But if I'm not able to make it available, then I will have to replace it with something else. Okay, but on Monday, I'm going to try and see whether I can request people in the library to give me this book, in which case then I can make PDF files and upload them, and we could have a discussion on these papers as well. Okay, so some of the papers that I have put up are really long with painstaking empirical work. Okay, we will have occasion to demonstrate how an initial theoretical insight is then transformed into empirically testable hypotheses, and how those hypotheses are tested, etc., etc., etc. So that is something that we will discuss. So we are basically dealing with fiscal policy, and of course, in some lectures there will be a discussion on monetary policy as well. Okay. Okay. Now, depending on the number of people I have in class, I will decide how the marking is to go, because if I can assign you papers that you need to review and submit a review of a paper. So if there are too many of you in class, I may not be able to find so many papers. But if the number in class are limited, then I would be able to assign each one a paper which they need to review on the basis of what has gone on in this class. And then we will have a final exam. But that is yet to be kind of finalized. Okay, any questions? Okay, so we have 16 lectures. So that's around, you have 2 lectures a week. So that's around 2 months. Okay, so over the next 2 months, we would be doing this. So any questions on the course before I try and convince you that this is an important topic? Anything that you have to say?
Sir, not the course, but I just want to confirm that you and Rajesh ma'am will be like, first you will be completing the 16 lectures, and
And
then
then
Rajesh.
Rajesh will talk about economic fluctuations, etc.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So my part is the first part. Then Rajeshwari will come in a few days. She's likely to send her outline as well. Okay. Strictly speaking, we should have had a third half credit course, so you would have a choice, but that has not been possible. Uh, there have been some shocks which we are trying to deal with in the institute, but nevertheless, okay. So unfortunately, Sudha has gone on leave. Susan has recently resigned. So, and Professor Suryanarayana has his last 4 months in the institute. So he's retiring in May, I think. So it has not been possible for him also to give a course. So we are struggling on that front a little bit, which I must confess upfront. But there is very little that I could do about it at this stage, because 2 people dropping out came as a big surprise to me as well. So in a short time, getting others to fill in courses which were already decided earlier was not possible. Okay, so with that caveat and that apology, shall I begin? Okay, if there is nothing else.
Sir, I just had a small minor query. So
हाँ
you said
बोलो.
that you have slightly modified the course that which you were teaching at IIM. So
Right.
have there been any parts that you have deleted which we will not be studying?
No, they are only additions. See, MBA
Okay.
students are not equipped to deal with research papers in any real way. So they struggled a lot. Okay, but you people are used to reading research papers. So this is entirely a research paper based course. So there is no textbook or anything, except this book by Akerlof, Blanchard, Romer, and Stiglitz, but which I'm not sure that I will be able to make available because of the library situation. But I will come to know about this on Monday. So in the next class, I will be able to say something firm about this. Actually, I was very confident that I had Xerox copies. I found my office upside down and I was not able to locate them. Therefore, the problem. But, we will deal with it because that's okay. All right. So can I go ahead with the formal lecture now, or is there anything else? Okay. All right. So some of the papers that I have mentioned here are path-breaking papers. For example, Gavin and Perotti. Okay, this is considered to be the path-breaking paper in this area. Buchanan and Wagner. Okay, this is another path-breaking book. Okay, and there are a few more papers which are hugely referred to. These books that I have given are basically just as a, you need to know basic macroeconomics. That's the only message. But I'm not going to do anything from these books. Okay, so I'm now going ahead. If there are no further clarifications to my lecture. All right. So is the slide visible to everybody?
Yes, sir.
Now we have to see whether the animation works, because on Teams sometimes animations don't work, so I'll have to delete them. But nevertheless. Okay, so what happened? Sorry. Okay. So the term macroeconomics applies to the study of relation between broad economic aggregates. We study the functioning of the economy as a whole, including output determination, what causes these totals to fluctuate. That takes you to business cycles. Okay. And since the publishing of Keynes's general theory, so we in macroeconomics attempt to develop an analytical framework for understanding what causes large and sometimes prolonged fluctuations in level of employment and incomes. Okay, so this is, but since the 60s, dynamic questions of growth have also been addressed in very detailed ways. Is the animation working? Or you're still on the older slide?
It's working, sir.
It's working, no problem? Yeah, okay. Now, so macroeconomists basically view a country to be continuously exposed to shocks, and these could be both internal and external. And this is a very nice quote from Furman and Stiglitz, 1988. This was a very, very, very famous paper by them on the financial crisis. Okay, I don't expect you to read that paper. It's a very, very large paper. But we are not dealing with crisis in this course. But I thought this quote is very instructive. An increase in vulnerability means an increase in the probability that the shocks, rather than being absorbed by the economy, will be translated into a downturn or a currency or a financial crisis. Okay, so the economy is being bombarded with these shocks. Okay, and generally speaking, the strength of an economy is gauged by macroeconomists by trying to say what are the variety of shocks that an economy can withstand or a country can withstand without there being a necessity of major output contractions. Okay. Or episodes of hyperinflation. Okay, so these shocks lead to two things which we consider to be very bad. That is output contraction, that is output and employment, of course, and serious inflations. Okay, now every country has an ability to internalize these shocks without output contraction or high inflation at different levels. Okay, the one reason why the American economy and the EU and more recently China, though about China there is some amount of uncertainty with this statement, but nevertheless China can be counted, are considered to be extremely strong economies because the menu of shocks that these economies can overcome without necessitating either a high inflation episode or an output contraction episode. Okay. And it is said that typically this list of shocks that can be overcome without experiencing a high inflation or an output contraction is very, very small for underdeveloped countries. Now, this is something that we are going to be bothered about. Okay, so from a macroeconomic perspective, this is what our perspective on the economy is going to be. There can be other perspectives, but this is going to be our main. Now, so currently we are dealing with the following issues. Okay, this you have. So what determines the level of actual output relative to potential output at any point in time? And this is what is standardly referred to in many standard texts as stabilization. That is, we build an ISLM or a Keynesian or whatever you have, we build a basic model where we try and figure out what determines the level of actual output relative to potential output at any point in time. Okay, and what is potential output? Standardly, potential output is if you employ all your factors at the maximum levels possible, what is the output that you are going to get? That's a very, very lame way of putting it, but the time series, people who have studied time series should tell us as to how this is to be done. We are going to come to that in a moment. So we are going to have to compare actual output relative to potential output at any point in time. Okay, and of course, inflation. That goes without saying. So when we are going to discuss this, who are the actors? Well, we have firms who are profit maximizers. We have households who are utility maximizers, life cycle adjustment of consumption. Our standard story about consumption smoothing will appear very prominently in this course. And governments, of course. Now, are you going to view governments to be benevolent, or are you going to view them to be opportunistic? Okay, because the utility function of governments is not something that we are going to discuss in great detail, but this is going to be there at the back of our minds. That is, politicians are going to try and follow policies that maximize the probability of being re-elected at the next election. Or if we take a Keynesian view of things, then elections don't matter and governments are benevolent. They try and do the best they can for the maximum number of people possible. Okay. So there will be some discussion on these two views of the government. Now, analysis of both fiscal and monetary policy with respect to electoral cycles has been initiated by a path-breaking paper by Nordos. But I'm not sure that I'm going to take you down that line. Now, I have worked on that area a little bit in the past, but looking at electoral cycles is something that I have consciously decided to keep out of our discussion. But if there is time and our discussion goes in such a way that this becomes extremely important, we could get it in. There are papers on India on electoral cycles as well. So this is something that I'm keeping as a side issue as of now. But as the course goes on, many of you may think that this is actually one of the main issues. But as of now, I am keeping that on hold. Okay. Okay, just to see how you react to the papers that we are going to do, how quickly we are able to move, and if do I have time in 16 lectures to try and introduce you to electoral cycles. But I'm not sure that we will have the time. If we have it, I will certainly do it. Okay. So now, and of course, there is the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world is going to be very important for us at certain points in time, especially the institutions that govern the borrowing and lending of governments, that is the IMF. But generally speaking, the rest of the world includes firms in other countries, households of other countries, and governments of other countries, and of course, the international institutions like the IMF. Okay, we will have some things to say about the IMF as we go on, especially in light of the Gavin and Perotti arguments that we will be looking at. And that will be an important part of our discussions for some time at least. Now, in macroeconomics, when we talk about stabilization policy, so it aims to influence deviations from full employment equilibrium or full capacity equilibrium, that is potential output. It concerns monetary, fiscal, exchange rate, capital controls, and income policy actions within the historically given institutional framework and domestic and international market structure. Okay, so we will obviously talk about fiscal and monetary policy. We'll talk very little about capital controls, so that can also be brought in. And we will say nothing about incomes policies because these have actually fallen out of standard macroeconomic policy options. So these are basically wage controls, okay, which were first initiated by the post-Keynesians, but these are not discussed so seriously anymore. But as a historical exercise, we should recognize that these wage controls were at one point a very serious part of macroeconomic policy making. They have since fallen by the wayside, at least officially. One does not know whether governments on the side bargain with unions, but that is not something that we are going to be bothered about too much. Okay. Now, we must recognize that stabilization policy is about policy actions within a regime. That is, we will have nothing to say about a change of policy regimes, right? So what constitutes this? Suddenly, if you have monetary policy run on the basis of, let us say, inflation targeting, and earlier you did not have inflation targeting, now that becomes a major change of a regime. Okay, or if the international financial architecture has given in the IMF lending programs to countries in trouble, that has not undergone any great change, but if it does, that will again be a change of regime. Okay, so we will have something to say about this, but we would be basically talking about stabilization policy within a regime. we will not be saying something. We will not be saying anything about changes in regimes. Okay, because you could see that fiscal rules, if they come into place, they also will constitute a change in our country. No, okay, there is a Fiscal Responsibility Act, etc., etc. But we will have something to say about that as well. But that will be as an aside. In terms of theory and empirics, these are not issues that we will be dealing with. So for us, the regimes will be given. Now, again, this is really trivial, meant for MBA students, but I will just very quickly go over this to just refresh ourselves. Okay, so a time series is a sequence of data points measured typically at successive time spaced as uniform time intervals. It can be decomposed into 4 components. Trend is the long-term movement in a time series. A seasonal component is if you have monthly data, those of you who have taken the time series 1 course will know how to deal with this. Okay, then you will have a cyclical component, and this is what we will be bothered about a lot. So it is a non-seasonal component which varies in a recognizable cycle. So this will be our main focus of analysis. The trend will not be the main focus of analysis. So all the data that we will deal with, all the papers that we will deal with, you will see the trend. Okay. And how they detrend, etc., we will discuss. This process of detrending is highly controversial. Okay, but those of you who have taken time series will immediately recognize that. So our idea is going to be to get a cyclical component of output. Okay, and as we go along, we will see how that is done, and an irregular component. That's fine. So various methods are available to decompose a series into its various components. We are dealing with annual data most of the time. So if we deal with quarterly data, then the seasonals will have to be, or monthly data will have to be dealt with. But most of the papers that we are going to study are going to have annual data. So we need not bother about the seasons. Okay. All right. So a standard tool that you will see is used in many papers. And those of you who have studied time series 1 will be aware of the Hodrick-Prescott filter. How many of you have taken time series 1? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. A lot of us did take time
Yes,
series
sir.
1.
And therefore, all of you are aware of the Hodrick-Prescott filter. Yes?
Sir, we had a course in Macro 2 and Tanya ma'am did this, Hardwick Prescott filter.
Excellent. So in Macro 2, you learned about the Hodrick-Prescott filter. That makes my life completely easy. So now the rest is really just a matter of division. Okay, so suppose this is the time series to be decomposed. Okay, let the trend component be this, and this can be derived from minimizing this expression. Okay, and this lambda is going to be a non-negative smoothing parameter, which is taken to be 6.25 for yearly data. This will change if you have quarterly or monthly data. This lambda number will change, but as we are dealing generally with yearly data, this is 6.25. Okay. Now, and the cyclical component is given by Ct minus Yt is equal to Yt minus tau t. Okay, so this I take as granted, no need to discuss this at all. Okay, Yeah.
Sir, she didn't go into the details as such. She did introduce trend, seasonal, everything, and she gave us some introduction on this. But we did not have time to go into empirics because the classes were offline, and we didn't do the programming. Yeah, part.
Okay, it's a one-line command in Stata. Okay, so the Hardrick-Prescott filter, there are many other filters which are available. Okay, Hardrick-Prescott is one of them, which is very standardly used. It's very, very, very easy to implement. In Stata, it is just rather trivial to do. Okay, there are controversies about this Hardrick-Prescott filter. More
Sir,
recently,
maybe if you can go through this derivation like quickly, it will be more useful for us because we didn't go into these details.
right. So look at the expression. You know, what does the Hardrick-Prescott filter do? It tries to derive a trend line, right? By minimizing what? So if tau t is your trend line, okay, which is unknown, okay, all right. So that's the first term. Okay, so you square the first term. Okay, and now look at the second term. Okay, so it is t plus 1 minus tau t, right? And it is tau t minus t minus 1. So what are you doing? You are trying now to, you don't want this tau t to be very volatile, right? You want it to be smooth, correct? This is after all smoothing a series, right? So a moving average is also smoothing a series, correct? So you can use a 3-year moving average and you will see that a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, whatever moving average smooths your series, correct? So your series is going to be volatile and you want to extract a trend line from this. How are you going to do it? The most easy way of doing it is to have a moving average. Okay, let us say a 3-year moving average process. Okay, and you can actually numerically do this and see that the series will be smoothed. Okay, so how this is derived basically depends on the imagination of the statistician who's trying to do this. And Hardrick and Prescott felt that this is the expression that will be the most useful. Okay, so the first is telling you that deviations around this, the square deviation around this are going to be minimized, but that's not good enough. Okay, we don't want these taus themselves to move around too much. You understand? And that is achieved by putting in the second term with a lambda which is 6.25. Now you will ask, from where did the hell did they get this 6.25? Okay, as I am aware, Hardrick and Prescott tried various lambdas and via various simulations tried to show that this is the correct number. Okay, they have a different number for different frequencies. So if you have monthly data, it is something else. If you have quarterly data, it is something else. So the attempt is to get a smooth series, nothing else. Okay, the attempt is to get a smooth series. Okay, and if you use the any software, this is what it will do. And no, notice that there are non-linearities here, right? So you will have to use some methods to actually minimize this. So you will have data on YT. You will have your lambda, right, which is 6.25, and then you will have to write programs to be able to minimize this. Okay, and that is what Stata will do for you. Okay, is that clear?
Yes, sir.
This is
Thank you,
very
sir.
much like smoothing. This is very much like a moving average in principle. Okay, but at a much more sophisticated mathematical level. Moving average is just arithmetic. Okay, this does something a little more complicated. Okay, mathematically, but the idea is to smooth a series basically. Okay, there is nothing more to it. Okay, okay. So this is what it will do. Okay. So this filter is used to obtain a smooth nonlinear representation of a time series that is more sensitive to the long term than to short term fluctuations. Now you just see the second term. So this second term, arguably, because you are not allowing the taus to kind of bounce around, okay, are giving a very large weight to the long-term trends. Okay, okay. So this is not going to the second term is not going to allow the taus to bounce around. Okay, so that is how they are going to achieve a smooth series, which is more sensitive to long term than to short term fluctuations. Okay. Whether this does this effectively has been criticized quite a bit, but it remains the most commonly used. Other filter like the backstacking filter are also used more recently. Time varying trends and all that are more in fashion. Some work done in IGIDR itself tends to argue that it is the time varying trends that are really the most effective way of smoothing a output series. But that those are matters which are a matter of detail, and the people who do a lot of empirical work on this count will be able to educate us about this a little better. Now, just as a demonstration, I have used this filter on real GDP data to see what we get. Okay, and I hope I will be able to convince you that the HP filter teaches us something. Okay, so this is real GDP. All right, I have not kind of updated my data for some years. For the last, I guess, 6 or 7 years, I have not updated the data. But this is real GDP. Okay, this is how it looks from 1955, I think, onwards. Okay, so this is real GDP. Now I use the HP filter and get the trend. So now you will be able to see that there are blips here. See, these are very large numbers, right? So even this may be looking like blips, but these blips really count. Okay, how much do they count? We will see. Now I use the HP filter and get a trend, and you will be immediately to see this is a much more smooth series. Okay, this is a much more smooth series. And now, if I take the difference between the two, we get a rather dramatic picture. Okay, so this is the cyclical component of real GDP. Okay, this is the cyclical component of real GDP. All right, so now you will be immediately able to see that 0 will be the trend line, correct? 0 represents the trend line because we are taking a difference of one from the other. Okay, when you are above the line, the economy is overheating. That is, your actual output is far greater than potential output, and you should see inflation. Okay, and on the negative side, your actual output is much lower than potential output, and therefore you are getting the negative numbers. Okay, and the trend line is taken to be potential output. Okay, so the trend line represents potential. So you see these fluctuations, they're pretty serious. Okay, and the aim of stabilization policy ultimately is to keep output as close to the trend line as possible. Do you agree with this statement of mine? So short-term macroeconomic policy or stabilization policy aims to minimize the distance between actual and potential output. That is, it aims to minimize these fluctuations. Is that correct? Yes, everybody agrees?
Yes, sir.
All right. So this is what we are going to be dealing with basically. Okay. So what do you think? Has the government of India been successful in stabilizing? This picture tells us possibly not. This picture, of course, can be criticized. This is the correct picture, but suppose it is. Okay, then it gives us reason to worry, right? So if you see the oscillations are in some sense increasing, no? In some sense, you are seeing an increase in volatility over the years. Okay, and if you put in recent data, it is going to go hugely below the trend line, correct? But that is due to a shock which nobody foresaw and nobody can do anything about. But be that as it may, this picture gets us a little worried as to what the hell is macroeconomic policy in our country doing in the first place. Okay. Yeah, are there any questions on this before I go ahead? Okay, I can go ahead, no problem here. Okay, now. So macroeconomic policy has been guided by how one reacts to the following three statements. Now, listen to these statements carefully. The first one is what we are going to be bothered about a lot in this and possibly the next lecture. But the first thing is macroeconomics fluctuations as described by the earlier graph significantly reduce economic well-being. Everybody agrees? Yes? On what basis can we say this? I want some reactions to this. This statement is going to be really important for us as we go along. So we agree that it significantly reduces well-being.
Because shocks can significantly dismantle resources.
No, look at the words being used. Economic well-being. So economic well-being is welfare, right? So macroeconomic fluctuations significantly reduce welfare, economic welfare. Is that a statement that we can go along with?
Yes, sir.
Really? On what basis?
Sir, if we look into the definition of macroeconomic fluctuations, within that employment fluctuations and also business cycle fluctuations might come in. So if the economy is at a down, then the overall welfare of the economy might be less. Like from that
Even in
point of
inflation,
view,
it will be less, no? So if actual
yes,
output is above potential output, you will have inflation.
Yes.
So the story is not only about downturns, it is about potential output being above, actual output being above potential output, that also leads to very bad outcomes, right? But on what basis can we say that it reduces welfare? So we can all claim, that we can go to the Himalayas and sit in tapa and imagine that, this is really bad. But is that good enough for economists? Economic policy can be run by going to the Himalayas and sitting in tapa. I have no doubt about it. Okay, the really gifted people can do that. But we have very few such gifted people, and those gifted people don't think about economic problems. So, should we take this on faith? Or can economists do a little better? So what will an economist do when he reacts to this statement? What will he try and estimate? He will try and estimate a welfare loss, right? So just like monopolies, there is one set of people who believe that monopolies are bad because large amount of welfare loss is, and the welfare loss from monopolies is very easy to imagine for an economist. It is that nice triangle over there, right? So if you assume some very nice cost curves, you will remember from your undergraduate microeconomics that there is that triangle which turns out to be the welfare loss, correct? You remember? And a large amount of research has gone into estimating that welfare loss in an economy. Okay, so when I used to do work on IO, these welfare loss calculations by due to monopolies were a big deal. Okay, and Haberger came up with a welfare loss which was really very small. Does anybody remember that? You must have studied this, no? So does any of the first estimates of welfare loss due to monopolies in the American economy by Haberger in 1950? Does anybody remember how much that was? 0.5%. Okay, and therefore the Chicago School argued that this whole story about antitrust and anti-monopoly and anti this, that, and the other has no economic significance at all because the welfare losses imposed on society because of the presence of monopolies is negligible. So they actually had estimates. You had to wait till the late 80s and early 90s for economists to be able to estimate this welfare loss in a different way and show that it is not insignificant. Okay. So from 1950s to the late 80s, economists were basically gunning for anti-monopoly actions based on whims and fancies. Somebody thought that the welfare costs are very high, so you should go against the monopolies. Others thought that the welfare costs of monopoly are so low that you should not bother. So you had one set of people arguing that antitrust should not be there, another set of people arguing that antitrust should be very, very strong, etc., etc. A similar story exists in macroeconomics, which normally people are not aware of. Okay, an identical story actually exists in macroeconomics. So in the next few slides, we are going to try and understand how these welfare costs of business cycles can be estimated. Okay, for an economist, going to the Himalayas is not an option. We must have methods that actually help us estimate the reduction in well-being because of economic fluctuation or business cycles.
Are we going to talk about the Kidlin-Prescott model?
But me, who?
Are we going to talk about the? Yes, sir.
Yeah, we are not directly going to talk about that. We are going to talk about some papers. Now, Kidland and Prescott also do this, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. But we are going to be a little more. So, if you have been exposed to Kidland and Prescott, we will not talk about Kidland and Prescott and talk about papers that you have not been exposed
Okay, sir. Okay.
to. Okay, we will go through the history of how this was done, and what are the pros and cons.
Okay,
Okay.
sir.
So, what was the Kidland Prescott number?
So we don't exactly remember the number, but we so that paper also talked about welfare loss minimization through minimizing the output gap and as well as
Right.
the inflation
Right.
gap. So
Right.
quadratic
So that is
terms and all.
standard in macroeconomics now, right?
Yes, sir.
So, but what were the kind of estimates they looked at? Do you remember?
No, sir.
Just look at it and tell me in the next class
Okay, sir.
if they have a number. You recollect they do, no, or they don't. So who is
Yeah. I'll get back to you on this in the
now?
next
Who is
class,
this?
sir.
Just identify yourself.
Issue, sir.
Issue. Okay.
Yes.
So you can get back to me.
Yes, sir.
Take it with the number as to what. So let's just go ahead. So next class I'm going to ask Issue what number there's Kidland and Prescott.
Sure, sir.
Come on. The next statement also is important. That the government is knowledgeable and capable enough to improve upon the free market. So suppose you come up with a number for this economic well-being, whatever it is, and suppose it is large, whatever, 8% to 5%, whatever. Typically, that number is taken to be a percentage of consumption, but it can be taken to be a percentage of GDP as well. So whatever that percentage that we come up with. Now, even if we come up with a percentage that is quite large, the next question becomes important. No? So, does the government have an understanding of the working of the economy and have answers at a policy level about what to do? Okay, and here macroeconomics gets into some kind of trouble because unambiguous answers are just not forthcoming. Isn't that true? So everything is predicated on the model that you are using to generate these answers is true, right? Okay, and many times people just don't agree on what is the correct model. So your answer to how you should respond to the shock basically many times becomes a function of what kind of a model setup do you have. You agree with this? Because different model setups will give you different answers. Is that agreed? In your course, have you seen this? Or there is huge consensus on both the model setup and the answers to the problems faced or the shocks faced. So you think there is unanimity amongst various models, or there isn't? Come on, somebody has to tell me what they think. Anybody? The macroeconomic models is giving you fantastic answers, which are completely unambiguous and correct. Then where is the problem? Then we have solved the problems of the world, and There is no difficulty at all, isn't it? None of you have anything to say about this? Okay.
Yes, sir. There are different schools of thoughts.
No, school of thought is a very strange word which I don't understand. It is basically a model setup, right? How are you specifying your model setup? So, unanimity amongst macroeconomists is unknown, okay? Right through its history. Okay. At one time, you had the monetarists led by Friedman, who ruled the roost, right? But then there were problems. Okay, then you had the new Keynesian methods of doing things, which again have shown up to be wanting. And now you have this DGSE new kind of way of doing things that is also showing some difficulties in arriving at unambiguous answers. So be that as it may. And the other difficulty is that you see on the downside you will have unemployment, and on the upside you will have inflation, correct? So do you deal with both of these equally? Are you more tolerant of one and less tolerant of other? This should be familiar, right? In macro 2, you would have dealt with a situation like this, right? So how is your loss function going to incorporate this? Okay. So these are the three questions that are going to bother us. Actually, it is only the first question that is going to bother us directly. The next two are going to come in through the back door as implications. But the first one is going to be a terrible thing for us. Like it was a terrible thing for the IO people who just did not have an empirical handle on the welfare losses arising out of this. Now the first paper, which tried to estimate the welfare loss or gain from stabilizing consumption around its mean, is small. This is Lucas, 1987, and another paper in 2003. And like all papers by Lucas are damned hard to read. Okay, but he empirically estimated that the welfare gain from stabilizing consumption around its mean is small, that is 0.002% of average consumption. If you write it as a function of national income, it comes to a little more than this. Remember, consumption is a very, very large part of national income, right? In the advanced world, this is referring to the US. So how much is consumption of US? More than 70%, right? Much more actually, more than 75%. So whatever the denominator you use, welfare loss as a percentage of consumption on national income, the number arrived at is so small, that is 0.002%. And Lucas then argues, why bother with the stabilization story at all? Just like the Chicago School argued that, look here, the welfare costs of monopolies are 0.5% of GDP, and why then should we spend so much money on the Federal Trade Commission, fund them, go to courts, break up firms? That is going to be very, very expensive. So it is pointless. In a similar vein, Lucas tried and argued that this whole stabilization story using fiscal and monetary policy is from a welfare perspective, from a consumption perspective, is trivial. Don't bother. Now then what do we do? Well, he says you just bother about the trend. Okay, get your economy, markets work functioning well, blah, blah, blah. And macroeconomic policy is hugely overrated. Don't bother about this so much. What are the nuances of the argument we will come to, but this is the basic story. He's saying if you concentrate on the trend growth rate, huge welfare gains are possible. Correct? No, of course. So if your trend growth increases, everybody is hugely better off. There can be no argument against this at all. So government should not so much be bothered about these deviations. Government should work on the trend. Do you agree? This is Lucas. Anything that you have studied earlier gives you this recommendation, or it goes against it. Don't take what I have written here to be the gospel. You must react whether this is, you agree, don't agree, what is the story. Okay. All right. Now, so then comes the obvious conclusion that governments thus should not attempt to deal with short-term fluctuations. So agreed. Is this a logical conclusion that can be reached? Yes or no?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
I think the Keynesian school of thought have different opinion on this.
No, forget schools, यार. ये school वूल क्या है? School बंद है. They will open. The question is, from the estimates that Lucas provides, we will come to whether you agree with the estimates, how those estimates have been arrived at, blah, blah, blah. We are going to get into that. But you cannot argue against this. If Lucas, and it is Lucas, it is not an Aira Gaira Vaidya who is saying that the welfare loss is small. Okay, it is Robert Lucas. You don't take Vaidya seriously, take Lucas very, very seriously. Now, if Lucas is saying this, then the logical argument follows that government should not attempt to deal with short-term fluctuations. No question about it. So if the welfare loss or the welfare gain from stabilization, whichever way you want to look at it, is so minuscule, then why bother? He is actually telling this to the Keynesians. That, Baba, if you want to convince me that the welfare gains out of your Keynesian story are large, show me that they are large. Fine, I agree with your models. Post, neo, simple Keynesian, complicated Keynesian, all that is fine. But can you give me a number which says that the welfare gains from successful stabilization are large? If you cannot give me that number, then your story has no clothes at all. Then you are claiming that, I am going to the Himalayas, sitting in Tapa, and saying that fluctuations are bad. So I come down from the Himalayas and say, let us have policies which minimize these fluctuations. But if you want to go by empirics, then this number has to turn out to be large for you to start arguing that my stabilization policies are relevant. Or you are going to ask me to take them on faith, which, as every good economist, will not agree. And you will appreciate that as soon as Lucas in 1987 came up with this ridiculously small number, all hell broke loose. And we will see how people started arguing. But the intrinsic logical, what shall I say, end point of Lucas's argument is this, that government should not deal with short-term fluctuations. Now, to resurrect this argument that the government should deal with short-term fluctuations, you have to negate Lucas's calculations, basically. Isn't it? So if this number was 5% of average consumption, then everybody would be sitting up. And then this last statement cannot be made. Agreed? Yes? Okay. So clearly, this position goes against the more popular concern about short-term fluctuations, which are believed to reduce social welfare. Like I said, I believe. So it is like saying, I believe monopolies are bad, and that's why we should not have them. Even though I am unable to come up with credible numbers of the welfare loss in an economy due to monopolies, I still believe that they are bad. That you would have to make that kind of an argument, which has its problems, which are obvious. No? That is, I'm using Himalaya economics. I'm going to the Himalayas and or sitting under a banyan tree, if it comes to that, to be enlightened that monopolies are bad. Even though I cannot come up with a number, I just believe that they are bad. So remember in 1987, when Lucas made this statement, you can imagine how much hell would have broken loose. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, shall I go ahead? Now the calculation. Consider an infinitely lived representative agent whose lifetime utility U is given by the present discounted value beta being the discount factor per period of utility is U dot. Okay, and this is our standard story. This utility in turn depends on consumption in each period CD. So this is my utility function. Okay, now we are on familiar turf, right? This should be familiar to you, no?
Yes, sir.
Now, in case of a certain consumption path, that is CT certain, we can write it as A e raised to GT, where A is initial consumption, G is the growth rate of consumption. Okay? Okay. This is the certain part of consumption. As neither influences costs of fluctuation, they can be normalized to 1 and 0. Okay, we are talking about fluctuations, right? So the certain path is the certain path. That's not a fluctuation. That's the, let us say, the trend. Okay. Okay, agreed? No problem. Can I go ahead? Yeah, I'm going ahead. Now, in case of a volatile consumption path, what do we have? Okay. Now, CTV, which is the volatile part, is 1 plus lambda A into e raised to GT, e raised to minus half sigma square into it. Sigma is the standard deviation of the log of consumption. ET is a random shock, which is assumed to be log normally distributed, so that ln ET is 0, and the expected value of e raised to minus half sigma square ET is 1. Okay, again, standard story, This comes out of the normal distribution, right? Yeah. No problem. ठीक है? Familiar? Okay?
Yes, sir.
In other words, average of certain consumption and volatile consumption is the same, correct? Because we have normalized it to 1, right? Earlier we normalized the average consumption to 1, right? And now the volatile consumption is also 1, right? Because the expected value turns out to be 1, correct?
Yes, sir.
So this lambda is the compensation parameter which measures percentage by which the average consumption has to be increased for the consumer to be indifferent between certain consumption path and the volatile consumption. So what are we doing? We are saying that there are two consumption paths. One is volatile, one is certain. How much do I need to compensate an individual to be indifferent between the two? Correct? This is the standard way in which we measure our welfare losses, correct? Or gains. Right? Now you see the question that we are asking. Okay, I'm going ahead now. Now let us set the two utilities to be equal. Okay. Now comes the huge insight that Lucas provides. Now he says, let's use this consumption. Let's use this utility function, where theta measures the degree of risk aversion. So in a business school, I would have had to explain a huge thing about this risk aversion. In this class, I don't have. Right? So we all understand what is risk aversion. So CT raised to 1 minus theta minus 1 divided by 1 minus theta, where theta measures the degree of risk aversion. This is the utility function that Lucas uses. Okay? I can go ahead. There's a very typical, I wouldn't say typical, but utility function. It has various properties that I don't want to go into here because we are not discussing this. So risk aversion is the reluctance of a person to accept a bargain with an uncertain payoff compared to another bargain with a more certain payoff, but possibly lower expected payoffs. So that is risk aversion. Okay. So now, with some mathematics which we are not going to discuss, those interested can go to the Lucas 87 paper and see how he gets the closed form solution. And the closed form solution is nothing but lambda is equal to half of sigma square theta. So this is very much like the Haberger story, right? In fact, in the monopoly case, some of the more recent papers in the monopoly case of welfare loss estimation put it as half of pi, that is half of profits, defined in a certain way. So in the Haberger calculation also this half comes in. Those of you who have read that paper will remember that these halves play a very important role in measurement of areas of triangles, etc., etc. So that's where it comes into the monopoly calculations. Over here, of course, this half comes from a different. So if you take it on faith and don't take it on faith, Lucas has shown this, and Lucas is no mean mathematician. He's a terrific mathematician. So this lambda is nothing but half sigma square theta. Okay, this we have to take on faith. We are not doing the derivation here, but mathematically, those of you who are interested can see that this will be the closed form solution. Okay, shall I go ahead? Yeah? Everything is clear up to now? I can go ahead?
Yes, sir.
Now, it is straightforward to measure from available data using US data between 47 and 2001. He obtained this sigma to be 0.032. So, the sigma square is very easy to get, no? It's nothing but the standard deviation of consumption. Correct? So, he calculates that to be 0.032. And this data, you can do this. Very easy. Detrend it, find the standard deviation. No problem. This is it. Use HP, whatever filter you want, whatever, any method, you will get the sigma to be of this small point range. He finds it to be 0.032. Now it is a little harder to obtain an empirical estimate of theta. This conversion kahan se laoge? Okay. But Lucas, being Lucas, is he is a genius. So there is some controversy. However, it is doubtful that theta is particularly high. Most estimates are no higher than 4. So let us assume it is 4. So Lucas says 4 it is. So the highest estimate he takes 4. Now don't ask me how to get an estimate of risk aversion. I don't have an answer. The statisticians would have done something and come up with this. Okay. And if Lucas says it is 4, it is 4. That's good enough. If it is good enough for McKenna, it is good enough for me. For those of you who have seen McKenna's gold. And therefore lambda turns out to be 0.002. This is not magic. Okay, this is hard empirics. Actually, people have called it Lucas's back of the envelope calculations. Okay. So an individual with an average consumption of $50,000 would be willing to pay $100 to eliminate fluctuations. This is still a very small amount compared to the implications of long-run growth on income, welfare costs of business, and therefore the punchline. Welfare costs of business cycles are small. Convinced? Or do you think there is a problem in the calculations? Nothing could be simpler than this, no. Or do you think there is a trick somewhere which Lucas is trying to pull the wool over our eyes? No reactions? When I read this for the first time, I fell off my chair. That, what does it imply for all the macroeconomics I had been teaching and researching on and studying? It left me completely devastated. It basically says that the emperor has no clothes. So all this fluctuation story is completely pointless. Are you convinced that it is pointless or no? Any comments on these calculations? So Lucas in 1987, based on these calculations, argues that people's concern about macroeconomic fluctuations arise due to the fact that these fluctuations affect the amounts of goods and services they consume. Aggregate yearly consumption expenditures can be viewed as the amount of resources that can be used to satisfy these needs. Since aggregate consumption fluctuates over the business cycle, costs arise due to the fact that individuals are forced to contend with volatile and unpredictable consumption. Okay. Now, all this is true. This is obvious. But let us look at it in another way. Consumption can be decomposed into two parts, a part that grows with time and a part that fluctuates over time. So trend consumption can be C star T. Actual consumption can be CT. It will deviate from the trend by a random percentage. So then we can write it like this. It's just another way of looking at the same calculations. Okay. Okay. The random deviation is assumed to be zero mean and independent across time. Without this assumption, nothing can be done. In other words, CT is equal to C star T on average. Now, let this utility function denote the value that a typical individual assigns to the consumption sequence. By what fraction would we have to increase lifetime consumption to make an individual with this utility function just as happy in a world where consumption never deviated from the trend. Okay. The answer would critically depend on how averse an individual is towards risk and the variance and deviations from trend consumption. We are back at the same story. And using empirically possible values of risk aversion and variance, Lucas arrives at 0.002% of consumption. This is a very small number, and any attempt to justify stabilization policies will be very difficult. Hello, Partho. No, I'm in class. I will finish in 10 minutes. I'll call you. Yeah. Okay. So this is very, very small number, and any attempt to justify stabilization policy will be very difficult. Of course, these conclusions will challenge. Okay, so the story about the challenge we can do in the next class. So any questions? Yes, Laksha, you had a question.
No, sir, nothing as of now.
अरे यार तो हाथ किसने ऊपर किया था? Okay, anything you want clarification? Okay. Yeah, because I don't want to start the discussion on the controversy. So first the calculations we will put up front, and then we will go into some details on the controversy. So the paper that I have uploaded goes through this controversy in great detail. So that is your first reading. Okay,
Sir,
so
where has the paper been uploaded?
On Teams. You can go and check.
Sir, even I wasn't able to find it.
Yes, sir. Like we
How is that? I will
we
try and
have
upload
not
it again.
been added, I guess, in the Teams thing.
Pardon me?
Sir, we might not have been added in the Teams for this course.
I have added all MSc 19, PhD 19. So I can't understand why that is not visible to you, but I will look at it again, because I just uploaded it around 15 minutes before the class started. So maybe if I have made a mistake, I'll check it. Okay. So today you will certainly be able to see it. If you can't, then you send me an email. Okay. It's a very, very nice paper. Okay. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. So we meet now on Wednesday. Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Somebody was saying something? Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'll see you on Wednesday at 11:30.
Thank you, sir.
Sir.